Despite these fears of the military, it was also during the Confederation period that the first real discussions about what the American military was going to look like, what American military requirements were, and how they should best be handled. It was during this period that these discussions first occurred. Uh, the new nation obviously needed some sort of peacetime national security policy once independence had been won. And the primary military requirements were pretty clearly you needed to police the border and the ocean frontiers. You needed to be able to defend against a full scale invasion. You needed to defend yourself against internal rebellion. And so in 1783, a committee of the Articles of Confederation government, headed by Alexander Hamilton, who had previously been one of Washington's staff officers, was created to think about how these military requirements were going to be addressed. And naturally, they went straight to George Washington and asked him for his thoughts. And sure enough, Washington obliged in a lengthy, carefully thought out document, which you'll find at the beginning of this week's module. It's called Sentiments on a Peace Establishment. And these were the main points. First of all, he believed that you needed to have a small, regular army, not large enough to pose any threat to liberty or anything like that. In fact, he had an exact idea of how many troops you needed: 2,631 officers and men who would be tasked with overawing the Indians, Native Americans, and also to guard against incursions from Canada and from Spanish Florida. He also thought that a respectable and well-established militia was needed. And Washington wanted it to be nationalized, with the central government imposing uniformity in training and in arms and in organization. And so you would have a two-tier militia system between a volunteer militia and a common militia. A common militia would be composed of basically the entire pool of eligible military manpower, all the civilians who were capable of military service, all the males who were capable of military service would be part of the common militia. But within this frame, you would have a volunteer militia who would be highly trained, who would be equipped to the same standard, who would have the same tactics and so forth, and who would be able to function at a high degree of military competence. This is what would later be known as a federal select militia. And this was very high on the list of those who wanted to see a strong American military within the realm of the moderate Whig critique. Washington also believed that you needed to have arsenals and factories to create these weapons and also to store them in case of need. And finally, he believed that you needed to have military academies where expertise in military affairs could be taught to a budding officer corps so that they would know what they were doing in case war came along. Well, the Hamilton Committee adopted most of Washington's ideas, but laid greater stress on a regular army. This reflected its nationalist leanings. In other words, this committee was more interested in having a stronger Confederation government rather than a weaker one. But Congress overall, predominantly anti-nationalist in tone, rejected the report. But Sentiments on a Peace Establishment nevertheless remains important because it is a kind of a wish list for those who believe in a strong American defense. And when you think about it, all through the rest of this course, all the way down through the 19th century to 1903, think about Washington's ideas of Sentiments on a Peace Establishment and look at how these gradually become part of American military policy. In the meantime, what Congress actually did was it disbanded the Continental Army, aside from 80 men and a few officers to guard the military stores at West Point. And instead, it created the first American regiment to be composed of 700 militiamen drawn from 4 states, and they would serve for 1 year. These are, by the way, these are reenactors showing this first American regiment. This is what these troops looked like. Think about it. This is a hybrid force. It's neither a regular army because it's composed of militia units from 4 states, but because it comes from 4 states and because they're serving for a year, it's not really a militia force either. So it's somewhere in between, therefore a hybrid force. And this first American regiment gradually assumed a more regular army flavor when 3-year recruits were sought. So you're going from a 1-year period of service to 3 years of service. Now, frankly, it was ineffective at meeting the needs of the Confederation from a military standpoint, but it remained the basic Confederation Army until the demise of that governmental system. Now, the Confederation failed for a number of reasons, but one of these important reasons in its failure was its inability to maintain internal order. And nothing exemplified this like Shays's Rebellion, which began in August 1786 and then continued until it kind of petered out in February 1787. What goes on with this is that a number of states had issued paper currency in an effort to keep enough money in circulation. Now, some states managed this well, but others did not, producing cycles of inflation and deflation, which upset the economy, which made it difficult for private citizens to figure out how to spend their money and whether they're going to get a decent price on the crops that they sold or not, whether they're going to get a decent price on the goods that they bought or not. This was very, very frustrating. And in Massachusetts, the fiscal burdens, Massachusetts was so deeply in debt that it created a crushing tax burden of about 1/3 of one's total income. And this led to foreclosures. People could not pay the taxes required to pay the property taxes on their land and on the farm buildings on which they stood. So, well, the only way you can foreclose on anything is by going to court and following that kind of procedure. So in the summer of 1786, there were mobs in Western communities, loosely led by a Captain Daniel Shays, who was a Revolutionary War veteran, and these tried to prevent foreclosures by shutting down the courts so they couldn't operate. Now, this rebellion, which was a rather minor affair, failed. And Shays himself fled to Vermont. But the public was jolted by how near run a thing this had been. Massachusetts government had real trouble gathering the funds to put down the rebellion, did not have enough troops to do it in any kind of sustained kind of way, requested help from the national government. None was forthcoming. The government wasn't set up to do that kind of a thing. And it indicated really that liberty might be leading to license. This was a direct attack on law and order, after all. And yes, the rebels had a point, and yes, Massachusetts was overtaxing and so forth, but this was not the way to solve the problem, to simply launch a head-on attack against the court system. So Washington, among others, was appalled by this. And so to conclude this, by 1787, Americans had come to recognize the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. and had also grown somewhat more confident that a stronger central government might be workable. And part of this realization extended to military arrangements. But how to create an effective military establishment that would not jeopardize American liberties. This remains an unsolved problem. Because of Shays's rebellion, but primarily because of economic problems arising from a system of tariffs that each state had, and system of finances that each state had, and economic policies that each state had, that all created, problems for the 13 states as a whole. It was decided that the Articles of Confederation arrangement had to be scrapped and a new constitution created. This was hammered out in Philadelphia between May and September of 1787. And there was a significant number of military provisions involved with this. I'm going to give you a little bit of a break here and pick up on those on the other side.